A bit on Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland. It's an all-island research network aimed at furthering research and information exchange on cultural policy in and across the island of Ireland. And it was established in 2015, so just coming up on 10 years, by Victoria Durer, now at UCD, and Carrie McCall McGann, who is Country Director for British Council Ireland. And it works in collaboration with academics from diverse disciplines and those working in the arts and cultural sector, seeking to connect and profile research relating to the various ways in which arts and culture interact with the social, economic, and political realms. Now, one of the ways that the Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland does this is through its New Read series, and today is part of that series. And this seeks to highlight and make available new published research, be that books, reports, or journals relevant to the arts and cultural sector. Across various gatherings, workshops, and seminars, it brings together researchers with arts and cultural producers, practitioners, and policymakers to share learning and new research. So, if you're interested to learn more about Cultural Policy Observatory Ireland, you can go to their website. I think the link will be provided, and you can also look at recordings and statements from previous gatherings. And there you can also sign up to the JISC mail, which is an email mailing list. Okay, on to today's session. So today's session is titled Audiovisual Cultural Policy in Ireland, an exploration of the challenges and opportunities facing the audiovisual sector on the island of Ireland today. And the focus of this session is a recently published open access special issue on that subject in the Irish Journal of Arts Management and Cultural Policy. If you haven't come across the journal yet, or you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, it's never too early to do so. The journal has been going now a little over 10 years, so it celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2023. So it's now at the start of its second decade. And I have the privilege to serve on the editorial board alongside some of the others on the call. The journal publishes work in four main areas, so original research articles. There's also policy reviews and conference reviews. And then it's got two really distinctive sections, perspectives and practice, and also new voices, which highlights emerging research from the wealth of student work at the master's level across the island. So if that's of interest to you, it's already been linked there in the chat, or you can simply Google IJAMCP. We're always seeking new contributions from new authors so that the depth of scholarship and the research of the journal can be expanded. Now, on to the special issue, and that's our focus today. So the issue is a collection of 8 original articles, which looks at this question of audiovisual cultural policy in Ireland. And it's across public service media, digital games, labour policy, taxation, Irish language film, neurodiversity, state agencies, and archival policies. And all of our panelists today are drawn from the special issue. So first we have Maria O'Brien, who is the editor of the special issue and also contributed an article herself. Maria is lecturer in taxation at the University of Galway. Kasandra O'Connell had been advertised to be here. Unfortunately, she was unable to attend, but Maria will be sharing some insights from Kasandra's own research. Also in this seminar, we've got Sean Crosson, who's senior lecturer in the Huston School of Film and Digital Media at the University of Galway. And finally, Denis Murphy, who is an independent researcher. Okay, so the format then for this session is as follows. Each of our speakers is going to give us a flavour of the article that they had within the special issue, and they're going to pull out their 2 sort of most important points as they see it. And then secondly, after a while, we'll ask them for their single most pressing issue from their research in terms of this subject. So firstly, on their article, and with that, we're going to turn to Maria O'Brien. Maria, as I say, is going to talk both about her article and also mention something from Kasandra's work. So Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Phil. Yep, I am really delighted to be here. I'm now lecturer in taxation in the University of Galway, but most of the work for this special issue was done while I was lecturer in arts management and cultural policy in Queen's University Belfast. And in theory, they seem like very different areas, but my research shows that they're not. So I'm going to take 2 points from the work that I did with the special issue. And the first one I'm going to just briefly mention from the introduction and kind of the foreword or overview. And this really speaks to my own research and to the research of all of those who contributed as well. And for me, it's really important to recognize that cultural policy as a concept is a really broad field. It, as already outlined in Phil's introduction, it very much captures areas of policy, including taxation, which is my own research, labour, education, health, neurodiversity, public service media, and much more. So I think what I really wanted to get across in the introduction was the history of that broad understanding of cultural policy from a practical, but also from a theoretical level as well. And that helps us to reflect on the wide variety of media forms that are covered. For example, there is articles in the special issue and articles in academia more broadly, in public service media, in new media, traditional film, games, and much more that are kind of captured by the concept of cultural policy. Policy interventions in and of themselves are also reflected in this, and then the theoretical underpinnings used throughout as well. I very much want to also point out that there's a number of key drivers within an Irish context that really kind of illustrate the interventions of the state towards the audiovisual cultural industries. And these are the transnational flows. While we're looking at Irish policy, we need to understand that Ireland is very much engaged with the transnational or global flows of production and consumption as well. There's very much the continued relevance of the local and the national within this context, and there is very much considerations of the role and funding of traditional and new forms of media. And what's particularly important, I think, throughout all the articles as well, is the importance of employment and employment conditions within media industries. So the second kind of key point I want to make, which I'm bringing from my article on digital games taxation policy, is the kind of very broad understanding that digital games in and of themselves are a form of cultural product. And this has been challenged both within the industry itself and within state understandings of the industry. And it also affects how the games industries are supported or not supported, as history has been, by funding from the state in multiple ways. I think I need to point out here as well that I am the chair of the board of IMERT, the games representative body, and in that capacity, I'm involved in policy decisions in this area, including influencing the shape of the tax credit, which I interrogate in my article. I don't think it's the time today to kind of challenge those concepts of ethics and methodology, but it is something that's very much in my mind as well in this. So I think the understanding that games in and of themselves are a cultural form, and that if that is understood both by the industry and by key policymakers, is the most significant point I want to make from that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria. And if you also want to now go on to talk about Kasandra O'Connell, as I say, unfortunately, she couldn't make it today. Kassandra's article was titled Perspectives on Practice Film Preservation Policy in Ireland, The Politics of Omission.
Thank you. But I do want to pass on Kassandra's apologies, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to summarize some of the points in her article. I'm really going to summarize the abstract for now and pull out one of the key points from the conclusion. Kasandra says that Ireland is one of the few Western nations without a state-sanctioned archive policy or for moving image preservation, and that there's a lack of formally authorised or funded national moving image collection or policy to protect it. It's really surprising, given that our membership of the European Union has stressed the importance of film heritage to society for decades and very much encourages member states to proactively preserve and disseminate their national film collections. But despite this requirement at EU level, which is also in the taxation credit, Ireland has neglected to implement EU film heritage recommendations, and while there has been some sporadic discussions of moving image preservation at government level, it's never been deemed worthy of specific policy, legislation, or resultant safeguards. So the absence of policy in this area has very much shaped official thinking and attitudes towards Irish moving image heritage, and support, financial and otherwise, for preservation are sporadic and ad hoc in nature. Policy and funding have very much concentrated on the production and distribution of new moving image work rather than the preservation and dissemination of heritage material. And I need to point out as well that Kasandra is the head of the Irish Film Institute's Irish Film Archive, the IFI Archive, and is also undertaking a PhD in UCC in this area. She looks at the imbalance in Ireland's film-related policy and the practical consequences of this omission. She looks at strategy and cultural policy documents to try and find some evidence of film heritage provision, and very much frames these findings within recent academic discourse examining the neoliberal turn in Irish cultural policy. She suggests some possible solutions to safeguard heritage moving image collections. Her paper is very much worth a read. I think it's a real groundbreaking paper in the area of heritage moving image preservation, but it also shows the importance of a broad understanding of cultural policies, that they're not just the policies that are in place, but also the omissions that shape what is preserved.
Thanks very much for that. And it's a great summary. And as you say, it's a great article, as they all are. I think I already said, and you can see it in the chat, but all of these articles are open access, so you don't have to get in behind a paywall, as with many academic journals. So do feel free after the call to go off and take a look at what's available, both in this issue and in previous issues in the journal. So thanks very much for that, Maria. We move now to Sean Crosson, who's from the University of Galway, and his article in this special issue is on Irish language film policy in Ireland. So over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks, Maria. And also, I just want to commend Maria on the extraordinary work she did in bringing together this issue. It's a really, I think, important and critical intervention into this area of audiovisual policy in Ireland. So I'm grateful to Maria for all her work and for the opportunity to contribute to the issue. So my own piece, as Phil has said, is looking at the Irish language and Irish language film policy in Ireland. And I guess one of the most obvious things to say at the beginning in terms of key findings is that we really haven't had a clear policy around the Irish language and Irish language film policy for much of the history of the state. And what you find rather through the development of film practice in Ireland, I suppose there's two related things. One is that the Irish language has had a significant presence, and in fact, it goes right back to the silent era, and you find its presence in relation to kind of key moments in development of film practice in Ireland. So, for example, its importance within the productions facilitated by the National Film Institute of Ireland in the 1940s, and similarly within the films that emerged in the 1970s through the kind of the first wave of Irish kind of contemporary Irish film practice led by Bob Quinn and others, but particularly in Bob Quinn's work, that the language had a key role to play there in terms of providing a distinctive cultural resource and, of course, cultural content as well. And that remains the case we see today, of course, over the last 6 years in terms of the extraordinary success that the Sine Cahir scheme has had in the films that have emerged from that, probably most famously on Colleen Kuhn, but also just in the last 12 months, Kneecap, and how these films are drawing on the resources of the Irish language to produce these quite distinctive texts that have resonated not just in Ireland, but also internationally. So I think it speaks to the importance of the language as a resource for film in Ireland historically and in the contemporary moment. In terms of policy, the key finding is not just that there hasn't been a kind of coherent policy around film. In fact, if we go back through the 20th century, there wasn't a coherent policy around film more broadly, never mind film in the Irish language, until relatively recently. And the kind of challenges and the issues that there has been historically in the lack of production, the lack of an infrastructure, the lack of a support structure to facilitate film speaks to the importance of policy, I think. And really, it's only over the last, again, particularly in terms of Irish language film productions, from the setting up, of course, a crucial policy decision taken by our current president, who was then Minister for the Arts, Michael D. Higgins, to establish TG Ceathair, which has been critical to the emergence of and the success of Irish language productions with Colin Kuhn, ECAP, and others in the last 6 years in particular. But there's a whole developmental period that I map briefly in the article in terms of how TG Ceathair provided an initial infrastructure and then connected with other state bodies, crucially Fí Screen Ireland and the BEI, which is now Commission Amman, and bringing those forces together to create the Sine Ceathair scheme, which has provided a kind of the certainty of an infrastructure of support, a coherent infrastructure of support that's allowed for the emergence of this extraordinarily successful period of Irish language film production. So I guess overall that is the key finding, is that when you look through the history of film practice in Ireland, and of course this just doesn't apply to the film in the Irish, but that a coherent, sustained, informed policy around the area is critical to its development, to its emergence, development, and its sustaining a rich and varied film culture in Ireland.
Well, thanks very much for that, Sean. And all our speakers have been really, really good with their timing. So we're actually well on track, which is fantastic. The final speaker then in this section is Denis Murphy. Denis Murphy is an independent researcher, and his article in the special collection was An All-Ireland Screen Policy, Public Subsidy and Screen Employment on the Shared Island. So over to you, Denis.
Thanks, Phil. And I'd like to echo Sean's thanks to Maria for putting together the article, the issue, which I know was an extraordinary amount of work over a number of years. So well done to Maria and everybody concerned. Apologies for my voice in advance. I'm a little bit ill, so my voice box is feeling the pressure. Hopefully I'll get through this unscathed. So, okay, All Ireland Screen Policy. Just a little bit of background, to be very honest about it. The article, I suppose, was inspired by a challenge that was laid down by a peer reviewer. We always say bad things sometimes about peer reviewer, but a challenge laid down by a peer reviewer of my recent book about the film industry. That book, Screen Workers and the Irish Film Industry. I've no idea who this reviewer is, but they suggested that my first book draft, which at the time was focused almost exclusively on the Republic of Ireland, might work better with a 32-county approach, which I subsequently adopted, much to the very much improved the book. So this article, I suppose, continues some of the analysis begun in that book, Screen Workers and the Irish Film Industry. And I hope, by the way, that the article is doing justice to, I suppose it's rather lofty question of an all-Ireland screen policy. And I'm putting forward a political economy perspective that tries to encompass the two separate industries we have on this island, North and South. So that's the first important point that the article is trying to do, to ask that fairly provocative question, I think, how might these industries begin to prepare for a reunited Ireland? And it struck me that I hadn't come across this idea yet anywhere in the Irish screen studies literature. And, with the possibility of a united Ireland being talked about more than ever, even our Fine Gael government, our Fine Gael-led government is kind of pushing this political idea as pretty much now as a kind of eventuality. So with that possibility in mind, I argue that the two industries might be better served by a strategy of cooperation rather than the competitive strategy that seems to be the case. And maybe because the Republic's industry is considerably bigger than the North's, I think this competitive spirit is especially visible in the North, where Northern Ireland Screen has explicitly declared its ambition to build, quote, the strongest screen industry outside of London, in the UK and Ireland. And this is a statement that originated in the Opening Doors strategy document from 2017, but it continues to be at the forefront of NI Screen's strategy, and even their current business plan, contains this statement pretty upfront. So that's the first point. Should we be thinking about a united Irish screen industry? And the second thing the piece is trying to do is to lay the groundwork, I suppose, for that ultimately cooperative project by tracing the trajectory of screen policy and screen funding in both jurisdictions, each of which has a history of increasingly generous amounts of public subsidy, with the twin stories of creating stories about ourselves, while also, and it's a critical also, creating employment and economic benefits of the foreign direct investment variety. And because my interests lie in political economy of media rather than textual analysis of media products, the piece tends to focus exclusively on the economic rather than the cultural. So I'm trying to examine how in each jurisdiction investment is justified by the potential economic benefits, particularly employment for screen workers. So how successful are the two industries on those terms? How can and do we measure this success? Do we have the tools and, most importantly, the data to properly evaluate the economic objectives of screen policy in both parts of the island? So those are the two main takeaways. Can we begin to imagine 26 years after the Good Friday Agreement, a united Ireland and a united screen industry? And because I believe we can, how does the data we have help us understand the scale of what might need to be done to unify those industries without losing their economic and employment impact, quite apart, of course, from their cultural impact?
Thanks very much, Denis. That's really clear and really provocative, and that's really what we're trying to do then in the second question, is to ask each of our speakers to kind of put across the most single pressing issue from their research in terms of this broad area of audiovisual cultural policy in Ireland. Now, as we've heard, this covers a range of different areas. Our three speakers today, and also hearing Kasandra's contributions summarised. This is but one area. This special issue goes into a much broader sort of set of issues. But from what we have here, if each of the speakers can now kind of put across their single most pressing issue, we're going to go in reverse order. So Denis, and apologies for your throat, it's going to be back to you.
Yeah, you're killing me here, Phil, but I'll do my best. Single most important pressing issue. I suppose to answer that question, I'll keep the political economy hat and concentrate on issues of industry funding. Don't get me wrong. It was interesting listening to Sean. I appreciate the cultural value of the output of the screen industries. The Colleen Kuhns and the kneecaps, which I recently had the pleasure of seeing in Coolock, of all places, across the road from the controversial protest site. But I appreciate the cultural value of that output and the need for policy measures that might encourage strong public service ideals and protect valuable cultural material from the vagaries of the market. So I'm going to assume that those kind of, protections will be put in place. But I also realize that this approach can privilege work of questionable commercial value. So there's a need to subsidize artistic and experimental and niche output, and what better way to generate the necessary funds than by encouraging a parallel commercial industry that provides, the continuity of employment for Irish filmmakers and other maybe more questionable economic benefits in return for production subsidies in the form of tax breaks, direct grants to incoming film and television productions, usually in the case of Ireland, productions from Britain and the USA. So the most pressing issue in the event of a united Ireland would be the withdrawal of film funding from the UK to the Northern Ireland, most obviously. So the big question is how to replace that funding. Now, you could argue that incoming film productions from the UK might continue to arrive, assuming that the Section 481 tax credit that incentivizes almost everything that's made in the Republic of Ireland, including a lot of that Indigenous content. You could argue that those productions would continue to arrive, and along with them, their economic benefits. But far less likely to be retained is the investment that ultimately derives from the UK television license fee. The BBC being a very, very significant spender in the Northern Ireland production market. I'm sure ITV is as well, by the way, but the figures for UTV spending are much harder to determine from at least after the efforts that I've gone to look for that kind of data. So how to replace that BBC spending is going to be a huge challenge, because it currently represents, I think, probably about 40% to 45% of the total public funding spend in Northern Ireland. So replacing the likes of the BBC is no mean feat, of course, especially considering the current state of RTE finances. But if we fail to replace this funding input, that's inevitably going to shrink the overall size of the combined industry, and that might mean less employment for screen workers, especially in the north of the shared island. So that's, I think, is the biggest challenge, replacing the BBC.
Thanks, Denis. Plenty in there for us to think about. And if you want to start getting questions in mind, once the rest of the panelists have spoken, we will be able to take questions. So, plenty in what Denis has said there to kind of whet our appetites. Sean, yourself then on the same question, the single most pressing issue.
Yeah, no, actually, Denis's remarks there are raise some really important issues as well. I mean, in terms of the Irish language, because as Denis will note, they've in the north there's dedicated funds that support Irish language production, and the BBC has got a department that has also been supporting Irish language content. So I think that should it arise that we had a United Ireland and that funding was no longer accessible, I think it would present serious challenges, and we'd have to reflect on how that would impact and how that would be replaced or resourced going forward. In terms of the single biggest I guess overall, we're always, film policy has always been subject to the vagaries of changing governments and priorities and government priorities, which we've seen, whether it was the closure of the film board and its return underfunding at different times, changing priorities in terms of emphases, and the Irish language certainly has also had that experience, being more the subject of rhetoric and rather than actually being resourced appropriately. So that kind of key thing, which I talked about in earlier, about having a kind of an informed, coherent and sustained policy around supporting film production, including in the Irish language, is critical. There's one point I raised it towards the end of my article that I didn't raise. Maybe I should kind of flag here, is one of the challenges, of course, in Ireland. I mean, an obvious challenge is that there's because of the failures of state policy around attempts to promote the use of the Irish language. There's it's a minoritized language in Ireland, but also within film production, almost all films that are produced and include a lot of content for TG4 are produced through English, right? So the cast are working through English. The context, the production context, is largely English speaking, right? And that's the reality that most people working in the sector don't have Irish. And then added to that, we were going through a particularly productive period in production more broadly. So there's a considerable demand on skilled practitioners. So one of the things I do flag is that, and as a result of that, there have been, for example, at least one scheme I'm aware of that was dedicated to production that had a requirement that you'd have an Irish speaking, at least two of the three main creatives Irish speaking, that had no applications because of that challenge to find, a crew that could actually work through Irish in that manner. So as happens in Wales, for example, with their Welsh productions, there are a kind of a language policy attached to the film productions as well, where they provide a context through which crew can learn the language, Welsh in that case, or in the Irish context, where you'd have some kind of joined up thinking around policy, that it's not just about the production of content in front of the screen, but it's facilitating a process through which those that are working behind the camera are actually, enabled to learn Irish and enabled and encouraged to learn and to use Irish in the practice of making films. I think in terms of the longer term practice of filmmaking, film productions, film content, I think that is a really important component of a healthy and kind of vibrant Irish speaking kind of film practice in Ireland.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And I especially like your phrase, informed, coherent, and sustained policy, which might be a bit of a theme running through these talks. Okay, finally then to Maria. Maria, you'll speak on behalf of kind of your point. Are you also going to say something on Kasandra? And if you do, you can kind of do it whichever way around you want.
I will, thank you. What I'm going to do is identify what I think is the kind of key point that Casandra's making in her article. And I hope I do her justice because her work is really strong. And then I'll spend a few minutes on that, and then I will kind of spend just identify the key point or the single most pressing issue that I see in my own research. And I've already changed my mind, just really I'm rephrasing it based on what the really interesting points that Denis and Sean have made there. So firstly, to start with Casandra's article on moving image heritage preservation. Just as a reminder, Kasandra is the head of the Irish Film Archive, hosted by the IFI, and she's a PhD candidate in UCC as well. And I think Casandra's points, they really speak to what Denis and Sean are saying as well here about just the lack of coherent, informed policy as well. And she says that moving image heritage preservation, it's an activity that needs to be supported and considered at state level to ensure that the relevant policies, funding, legislation and standards are in place. The EU recommended in 2005 that there's a vital importance of placing film heritage at the core of state cultural policy, but Ireland has not taken this approach, and that very much Ireland is far behind EU counterparts in this regard. Now, the reasons for this are varied and complex, and I'm going to refer you to her article on that as well. She said it's very much film heritage has suffered from the difficulty the Irish government has in categorising it for administrative and strategic purposes. And I would really add for valuing film as cultural form broadly. Film heritage doesn't come neatly within the jurisdiction of any government agency or department, which is really shocking. And as an NGO, so the IFI does not come under the umbrella of state policymakers and has no formal route into the mechanisms of central policy creation. So it's very much an overlooked area. It's a major factor that it was the area of film heritage was omitted from the Culture 2025 suite of policy and implementation documents. There's a lack of clarity about where film should be positioned from a policy perspective, and that's very much compounded by the neoliberal turn in cultural policy that has developed in Ireland, alongside much of the West as well. And if there are questions in Casandra's article, I think it's probably best that we direct them directly to her, either by email or just put them in here and I can forward them to her as well. Then to my own as well. So I want to make and I want to actually start, I'm really kind of embarrassed that I didn't think about thanking people. I want to thank all the contributors, including, of course, Sean, Denis and Kasandra, and the others who can't be with us today. And I particularly want to thank all those reviewers as well. I was greatly encouraged by how proactive reviewers were. I think only one person who I asked couldn't review for us because they were really busy with workload, but they did reply really quickly. I know that is very unusual in the area of reviewing, but it just shows the importance of the subject and the strength of the articles that were submitted as well. I also want to thank the rest of the board, and particularly Fiona Lowe for all her really strong work in editing and helping get the journal into the shape it is. So then kind of the major, and I also want to thank the board for inviting me to do this special issue as well. It was really exciting. It was a long slog, but it was really exciting to do. So then to my own article and kind of the single most pressing issue that I identify. I'm pulling one point from my intro where I say that we must remind ourselves that public policies are encapsulations of hope and aspiration. And with my kind of policy nerd, political economy hat on, I really want to kind of make it clear that policies are put in place to achieve specific objectives. These objectives may be undefined, opaque, or misguided. There are a number of policy theories to try and predict how policies might turn out, but it still is very much an area of imprecision. And I think us as film and cultural policy academics need to understand that the policy process is shaped by multiple conflicting goals at times. So trying to identify how policies are going to operate and what they're going to support is a very inexact science. There is a role for academics to play in informing policy, in getting involved in policy discussions, in harassing, I suppose, policymakers to give them key research findings that we have, but also to kind of translate those research findings for them as well. And then I think to put that into particular conversation on tax credits for digital games, I think it's really important to illustrate that the evaluation of policies and the evaluation of policies like Section 481, the film tax policy, and Section 481, the games tax policy, are again very incomplete and inexact. They are valued primarily for their economic considerations, and this is very much developed in the article by Pat Brodie in the special issue as well, and Denis alludes to this also in his and another work. That the tax credit incentive regimes are increasingly a feature of the production landscape in many jurisdictions. I think there's over 100 identified by Alsberg SPI, the creative industries consultants around the globe. Ireland has been a forefront at this as well. And there's very significant opportunities for production that are supported by a generous tax credit of up to 32% of eligible expenditure, which for film is being increased by 8% for some productions, up to 20 million spend, and also the coming in of a tax credit for unscripted production, which was formally announced in this year's budget, and that had been flagged in the previous year's budget, is going to be really interesting to see not only how it incentivizes particular forms of production, but how it is considered by policymakers to be a valid form of cultural policy. And I think it's key to my research to interrogate how tax policy in and of itself is a form of cultural policy that shapes the cultural artifacts and the cultural products that we all consume and that represent us and are very much representational as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks to you, Maria, for covering both of those articles, and thanks to you for editing the special issue and doing such a great job. For everyone on the call, as you can hear, there's a set of fascinating contributions here. We've heard from Denis a provocation around what might happen in the event of United Ireland in relation to BBC funding in the north. From Sean around the importance of informed, coherent, and sustained policy. On behalf of Kasandra, the ways in which film heritage has suffered and the lack of state protection for this. And then from Maria, the ways in which there's a focus on economic rather than cultural goals at times, and the importance of us seeing imprecision as cultural policy researchers and how we need to understand multiple conflicting goals.